Alrighty, welcome back, guys. It's time for part two. Yeah, part two of the 19th century reform. So, if you haven't seen part one, you should stop this video and go back and check out part one and get that done first. Because, see, you should do part one before you do part two. That's why I labeled them part one and part two. Like, I tried to keep it simple for you guys. I mean, I thought about going like part one and part next, but then I don't know, part one, part two seemed a little more normal, which is kind of odd for me. But I digress. So here's the deal, guys. So we're going to pick up right where we left off in the last video, which is with those 19th century reforms. And so we did cover some of them, right? So we covered the Second Great Awakening, which is the springboard for the whole thing, right? Definitely got to start there. We talked about temperance. We talked about education reform. We talked about prison reform. Woo! Yeah! How exciting are all those things? And some people were like, yay. All right, so part two, this might be a little bit longer. I don't know, but this is really how they break up the best to try and make this into smaller chunks for you guys, so you guys aren't having to sit in front of a video for like forever and then get distracted by like the squirrel that you see running outside your window. And so we're gonna keep this kind of simple here for you. But again, remember, guys, each video has its own assessment, okay? And actually, it's its own set of notes. They actually go together. They could be a single note sheet. But I broke them up there for you so there's less confusion for you guys as much as I possibly can. So, all right, so what we're going to do, let me go ahead and get this pulled up for you guys. I know you're just dying to get right in, right? I know. All right, so this is our wonderful picture on the 19th century reforms. So here we go. All right, so next thing we're going to take a look is this thing called abolition. Okay, so abolition is very similar. You may have heard of this word called abolish. It means to get rid of. Well, abolition, or an abolitionist actually, is a person who wants to end slavery. This is a term that was used in the mid-1800s, so in the 19th century. They want to end slavery. Okay. So what we're going to do here first in abolition is a little bit different than how we went through some of the other reforms, because there's a whole lot of things going on with abolition. And so I want to make sure we get it all in. So I want to make sure there's certain terms, phrases, key things that we understand up front, because you're going to hear it a lot. So an abolitionist or an abolitionist newspaper or whatever it is means that they're wanting to end slavery. They want to abolish it, get rid of it. Now, another famous thing that comes out of this era is this book actually called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, I thought about having you guys read that, but it's kind of long. It's long. And so maybe you will get a chance to read it. It's definitely some reading that I had to do in high school way back in the day. I know it seems like eons ago. It's like forever. And so, but here's the thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It really depicted, for the first time for the broad population, the cruelties and horror of slavery. It was ridiculed in a lot of ways, obviously, and you'll see later on there were actually certain folks in both the North and obviously the South, but definitely in the North as well, that were opposed to abolition and ending slavery and these kinds of things. But what Uncle Tom's Cabin did, it swayed a lot of public opinion against slavery, particularly in the North, and even some pockets in the South, to be honest, guys. A lot of people don't really realize that, but we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get even further, really into the Civil War. But not everyone in the South was like, slavery's it on a stick, kind of thing. Man, this is like, they're really, obviously it was a predominant number of people, but it's not like the entire South was monolithic in this, okay? All right. Now, the other thing that you guys have heard about some, is what's called the Underground Railroad. And what it was is they moved escaped slaves to freedom through a series of safe homes or stations. And they actually used the North Star. They actually also used a lot of songs to communicate where the places would be or when the next person was going to be there to help, whatever it is. They used a lot of these things called spirituals, that we'll talk about when we look at slavery. But they used this, which was a common cultural practice for them anyways, but they used the songs to communicate this information about where the safe houses were and stuff like that, to try to help keep them hidden. All right, so these are some key things. And again, we're going to touch on these a little bit more too as we go through this. All right, so if you haven't gotten the notes, you can hit pause. Okay, so all right, now the first group we're going to take a look is African American abolitionists. Okay, now as you would expect, quite a few African Americans were obviously against slavery and getting rid of it. Okay, now, but there were some that were, shall we say, more prominent or more well-known than others. Now, first of all, we have Frederick Douglass. Now, what's couple things are important about Frederick Douglass. One, he was a former slave. So the stories that he was able to tell were out of personal experience. Before really he comes on the scene, the stories that we have on slavery are really, it sounds right, they're coming from white people. So the white folks in this had never been slaves in the South. And so it was sort of, didn't have the impact as it would have a personal story coming from Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass was a self-taught man. He learned to read and to write, and he was his speeches were, he was a great orator, but he was also sort of bold. I mean, there's no sort of to it, I guess, really. He was a very bold person. And in fact, in the middle of the Civil War, right, he decides that he needs to have an audience with President Lincoln. And so he doesn't get an appointment. He just shows up and says, I need to see Lincoln. Now, to a certain extent, this was a common practice in this era in American history to sort of just show up to see the president, but not in the middle of the Civil War. Obviously, Lincoln's security was on high, much higher. There were all death threats all the time for him and things like that. But he showed up and said, I'm going to meet with Lincoln. And he did. And in fact, a lot of people really think that meeting just helped to solidify a lot of Lincoln's beliefs on slavery. Okay. Now, another famous African-American abolitionist was none other than Harriet Tubman. All right, now there's been a recent movie about her that's actually supposed to be quite good. Personally, I haven't had a chance to see it, but it is supposed to be very accurate and very good. She's the most famous of all the conductors of the Underground Railroad. Now, the conductors were the ones that were leading the escaped slaves from place to place. Okay, that was their job. Now, understand how crazy this was, that she was a former slave. And so she was really risking not only her freedom, but really her life in general, to go back down into the South to help others. Now, the Underground Railroad was obviously important. More really, though, in all actuality, is really more for its symbolism and what it represented than the actual number of slaves that were able to escape. Compared to the total number of slaves in the South, the Underground Railroad there weren't a lot who escaped. Now, obviously, any slave who escapes is important and valuable, but when we sort of step back a little bit, it was really symbolism of it. The fact that you had this former slave coming down and helping other escapes escape, it was really a slap in the face to the slave owners. And that's really where her value was, because it gave a sense of hope. And hope, guys, listen, hope is a powerful, powerful thing. And so the slave owners, if they had a huge actually bounty out for her because they wanted to eliminate any hope for their slaves. Okay. Now, another one that you probably never heard of, you may have heard of the first two, but you probably never heard of the last one, which is Sojourner Truth. And yes, that was her name. Okay, this isn't just a name we made up later. No, that was her actual name, Sojourner Truth. And so Sojourner Truth was not only an abolitionist, but she was also very prominent in the women's rights movement. Okay, and so one of the things that Sojourner Truth really spoke on was that she believed that women were just as capable as men. So now she's a former slave. Again, so all three of these you'll see were all former slaves. And so she is speaking not only against slavery, but also for women's rights. And so as I told you before, you'll see that a lot of these people do sort of cross over from one reform area to another. Because again, a lot of this comes from that, again, from the Second Great Awakening and the idea of I've made myself better and society can also be better. That was sort of this foundational concept. Now, you also had a number of what's called white abolitionists. Okay, and so your white abolitionists, arguably really the most famous of them from the era is William Lloyd Garrison. Now, he's not famous so much for himself. I mean, I guess he is, but it's really because he owned and ran an abolitionist newspaper. And so we think of today, a lot of people say that newspapers and journalism is supposed to be unbiased and all these things, but that wasn't always really even the notion of newspapers. In fact, during the early 19th century period, newspapers were born out of having a particular bent or perspective. That's why one of the reasons you have had so many of them, because you had newspapers that were for slavery and against slavery and all these different things. And so one of the things that William Lloyd Garrison did is he published an abolitionist newspaper. So he was able to get out information about why slavery should be eliminated in the United States. Okay. Now, A couple of others were Sarah and Angela Grimke. They were from a former slave. They were from a slave-owning family, but they grew up to be great speakers and writers on abolition. Okay, so they come out of this and they lived it. I mean, their families were slave-owning family, and yet they saw it and said, "This isn't right." Okay. Now, then you have Harriet Beecher Stowe. All right. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Guys, it's really hard to put into context how important this book was. It sold like crazy throughout the North, and even to a certain extent, some in the South as well. And as influential as newspapers were in that era, I mean, guys, it's not like now, right? You've got the internet, you've got stuff on your phone, you got 7,000,000 ways of getting information. In this time period, your information sources were fairly limited. So you had newspapers primarily, and you had books. I mean, you had other things, speeches and stuff like that when people may, but the fact of the matter is these were two of the main sources of information. And so when this book comes out, um, this eventually it becomes put together as a novel, as a single book eventually. They've actually made plays that off of it and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it fundamentally changes a lot of the popular opinions on slavery. Really, before this time period, you have your abolitionists. And what you really had in the North is a lot of folks who were like, yeah, I guess it's bad, but I don't know. It's not that big a deal. I don't really care. I mean, you remember when we talked about sectionalism, that really slavery is just not a big deal in the North. That really shifts with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Because now that's put in right in front of their face. They're reading this and they're going, like, this is true. And then you have somebody like Frederick Douglass come along and say, basically, yeah, that's true. Like that was my life. Those kinds of things really happened. I saw it happen. And so all this really starts to bubble up, and more people in the North are like, we got to get rid of slavery. Not that we just can't stop. We got to stop it from expanding. We got to get rid of it. Okay. And this is why I bring up Uncle Tom's Cabin, because of how much it fundamentally shifts that public opinion. Now, there were those folks that were opposed to getting rid of slavery. And I know you're thinking to yourself, but how can that be? Like, that's just so common sense to us. Like, yeah, slavery is terrible and horrible. Why wouldn't you want to get rid of it? Well, there's a reason why it's existed throughout human history. Okay. And so let's take a look. We're going to break this down into both Northern and Southern, because there were folks in both the North and the South that were opposed to slavery. So many in the North actually had this idea that African Americans would not blend in once free. I know you're thinking that makes no sense, right? Like, who says that? Who thinks that, right? Well, they did, okay? And it's terrible and horrible, and I don't know how you think that way, but they did, right? And so, excuse me. And so this is where I've told you before, guys, that there is this idea that in the North, that it was all like hunky-dory, right? And then the South was all terrible. Like, basically what you had is that you had in the South that everybody hated African Americans in the South, and then everybody in the North just like, yay, it's all equal and yay, great. Okay, but that's not actually how this broke down. Okay, and so this is one of the reasons I bring this up, is because I want to make sure you guys get an accurate picture of the history. Okay, I don't want to sugarcoat things. I don't want to tell you. I try not to tell you too bad to one side or the other, and let you decide. Okay, I just present you the facts on this. Okay, all right. Now the other thing is you had Southern opposition. Now Southern opposition was had multiple facets to it. Okay, first thing you would hear is they were needed for menial tasks. This is the idea that we need slaves to take care of those things that are just like really low on the totem pole of things to do, right? Okay, I guess. Now, the one argument that the Southerners make, that there is a certain amount of, I say truth, maybe that's a little too strong a word, but there is something to this particular argument. And we'll look at this more when we get into the life of slavery. But they did make the argument that slaves were better off than factory workers in the North. And I know you're thinking, but how can that be? They're slaves. Well, part of that has to do with how terrible the conditions were and how just bad things were for factory workers in the North, it also is coupled with the fact that there are certain things that slaves got that, say, what would be called poor whites did not have. For example, medical care. Okay, thinking what? Well, think about it. A slave owner has made an investment in the slaves. That slave owner wants the slave to be as productive for as long as possible. So they have an incentive to provide them with a certain level of nutrition and medical care, because it's a selfishness for them. It's not because they have some compassion for the slave, but it's because for them it's an investment for them. Okay, and so they have the end result though is that, comparatively speaking, again, this is a comparative thought, not that one was good and one wasn't. This relative concept here, that for many slaves, their conditions they were working in were better than factory workers, because factory workers worked just as long, just as many days. Okay, a lot of these things, and they didn't have some of these things that many of the slaves actually had. So again, I'm not saying I think slavery is a good thing, but you need to understand this argument, this one here, this and you can't really see me pointing at it, but better off, this idea that they were better off than the factory workers in the North, there is some factual evidence to back this one up. Okay. Now the last one, which is just the most terrible and egregious of the whole thing, is this whole racist concept of argument of inferiority, which is just, there's a lot of words for it, many of which I can't say because this is like a school thing, but it's just dumb, guys. It is just dumb and stupid. Okay, it's the worst of all the Southern arguments when it comes to defending slavery. Okay, all right, so that's abolition and the opposition to it and how all that worked out. Okay, now let's go ahead and we're going to take a look at one last reform area, and that was what's called the women's movement. So we're going to break this down in a couple of pieces. Some of the leaders, who the different leaders were. We're going to take a look at what's called women's suffrage. Okay, and this is usually associated with the women's right to vote. It's really what a lot of it deals with, but there were a lot of other issues at hand. Now, the first thing is the Seneca Falls Convention. This is actually in 1848, and it was the first women's rights convention. Okay, and so all these women gathered together to have speakers and say, hey, you know what, we believe we should have a lot of the same right, really all of the same equality. It's not exactly how they would have phrased it, just because of like language differences from like almost 200 years ago, but that's really what they were talking about. And so at the Seneca Falls Convention, there was this thing called the Declaration of Sentiments. All right, and what the Declaration of Sentiments basically was is to say, hey, these are the things we want. It's a declaration of sentiments. In other words, we're declaring these are the things we want. All right, now a couple things were ending discrimination against women, for example. Women wanted the right to vote, and they wanted the right to work in, quote, male jobs. Okay, again, this is really what we would call equality today. Now, a lot of this was actually gaining quite a bit of momentum, and it really got stopped by the Civil War, guys. I mean, this is 1848, so you're talking the Civil War is 13 years later, it begins, and so right? No, 20, yeah, 13. Okay, good. I can still do math. 13 years later. And so a lot of this sort of gets put on hold and pushed till really either the end of the 19th century or first part of the 20th century, which is really unfortunate for women. And in fact, it's very interesting. We'll talk about this towards the end of May, where there's a lot of women that are looking around going, wait, white women in particular are looking around, but African-American women as well, like, wait, why does he get the right to vote, but I don't? Like, it's really interesting. You gotta understand, a lot of these women many of them, they won the right to vote, for example, but they were still racist. Okay, and so when former slaves in the South get the right to vote, it really sort of, women are looking around going, white women are looking around going, what? And then the African American women are looking around going, why does he get it but I don't? And so it actually caused quite a bit of problems in what's called the Reconstruction era. But women, obviously today, they have equal rights, they have equal standing, all kinds of things. But with the women's movement really does get derailed by the Civil War. Okay. Now, some of the leaders. So first of all, you have Lucretia Mott. She was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was also an organizer of the Seneca Falls Convention, and she also was really one of the primary writers of the Declaration of Sentiments. Okay. And then you have arguably the most famous of the women's movement leaders, and that's Susan B. Anthony. In fact, she's actually been on U.S. coins. You have Susan B. Anthony dollars and stuff like dollar coins, actually. So she's definitely the most famous of all the women's movement leaders. But she was more than just about women's right to vote, the women's suffrage movement. She also called for things like crazy concept, right? Equal pay, right? Like, so you'll remember, I know you guys talked, there was a little bit in some of your readings about how in those early factory workers, the women, man, they were great. The factory owners wanted to bring them in because they could pay them less. And they said they were paying less. So, well, we're only going to pay you 50 cents or whatever it may be because, you know, I mean, you're just bringing in extra. You don't really need the other, right? I mean, we're just, you know, that was kind of the argument. Like, oh, well, okay, that makes sense. No, it didn't, but that's what people would think or say. And so Susan B. Anthony was really one of those ones that was really calling for that equal pay concept. All right, equal pay, equal work. Okay. All right. Some other leaders in this movement, education and professional leaders. Catherine Beecher. She had this idea that women need an education to be successful housewives and mothers. Okay. And so she just, this is what she believed. And she's right, to be honest. You have also Emma Willard. All right. And Emma she taught herself math and science. She opened a school to teach women math and science. Okay. And then you have Mary Leon. And she also opened a school to teach women so they get the same college education as men. And so what you really have here is this really is focusing on the educational part for women in equal access education. Okay. And so they just opened up schools. So you know what, forget this. We're just going to open these schools up for women and they're going to learn because they should be able to learn. They shouldn't not learn just because they're women. This is foolishness. Okay. So there was a tremendous amount. This women's movement had a tremendous impact on the society. Okay. Before it, for example, most teachers were men. And if you look around, say you look at the school teachers that you guys have had through the years, right? Most of them are women. Well, that shift begins in this era because one of the impacts of this is that education and teaching becomes options for women. So not only do they have the option of going to school, but now they have the option of getting a job as a teacher. And in fact, over time, it shifts to where really teaching is seen primarily as the role for females, particularly in the public sphere, that sort of K through 12 time period, the educational time period that you guys are in the midst of, right? Is that most of your teachers are women, and most of your teachers by the time you graduate high school are going to be women. That is what's happened. So this is a huge shift from pre-women's movement, mid to early 1800s to now. Okay, and it's been a fundamental shift. All right, so now in some states as well, you have things like joint custody of children after a divorce. You have property ownership. We sort of touched on that a little bit in sectionalism, particularly out west, but even not just out west, now in other states, you start to see women can actually own their own property. And they can also now in many states seek divorce, whereas before only the husband could seek a divorce. Now in some states, women can do this, okay? So again, this is all more, women are gaining more and more power, more and more equal footing with men, and not only in society itself, but also in legal realms, so sort of the law itself as well. Okay. All right, guys. So that is the 19th century reform movements. Okay. So I do hope that you were able to get all the notes. Again, if you weren't, beauty of YouTube, go, I don't know, whichever way it is for you on your screen, whatever. And you can go back and you can get what you missed. You can always pause it. You can try the closed captioning, whatever it is, guys. And so I know this wasn't a perfect video. I get that, guys, but it's really Anything ever perfect in our class? Yeah, not so much. But guys, here's the deal. All right. I hope that you were able to get what you need out of this. Again, if you guys have any questions, you got Remind, you got SB, you got text, all kinds of ways that you guys can ask and get what you need. All right. So I do have one more video I'm going to get out there for you guys. It's going to kind of explain sort of the culminating assignment for this week. So again, make sure you did part 1, then part 2, and then you're going to go and do the third thing for this week. If you try and do them out of order, it's really not going to make a whole lot of sense. All right, guys. So see ya.